Everybody, we have reached the bottom of the hour, so let's get started with today's L10 webinar, From Efficacy to Access, the Importance of Oncology Business Acumen, sponsored by CMR Institute. My name is Tim Sosby. I'm Editorial Director for L10. It's my pleasure to welcome you today and to serve as the host of our webinar, and I'm going to start that with some housekeeping items. We are planning a 30-minute session for you today. You'll notice that your phones are on mute, but we do want to hear from you throughout today's webinar. So if you have any questions, any comments along the way, we'd love to have you join the discussion. Just type in your question or comments into the questions module on the control panel. It should be on the right side of your screen. Type it in, hit the send button, and we'll receive it and get to it as quickly as we can throughout today's program. We do love to hear from you throughout today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand in the L10 Self-Directed Learning Library. I'm going to share an address with you for that library later in today's program. I'm also going to send you a follow-up email about 1 hour after today's webinar ends with a link to the recording. So through the L10 website or through that follow-up email, you'll be able to access the recording or any other recordings from L10 webinars. And if you have any questions about any of that, you can always reach out to me at my email address showing here. I'll share that address with you later in today's program as well. And I'm always happy to help with any webinars or membership needs. Okay, with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our speakers today. I'm going to turn things over to our moderator to get us started. You're going to be hearing from Michelle O'Connor, President and CEO of CMR Institute and a member of the L10 Board of Directors. Michelle, thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate the introduction. I'm delighted to be here today with two industry experts, Gary Rice, who is Senior Advisor of Specialty and Clinical Strategy at MedImpact Healthcare Systems, and Dr. Ivo Abraham, who is Professor of Pharmacy, Medicine, and Clinical Translational Sciences at the University of Arizona. And for those of you who may not be familiar with CMR Institute, we are a nonprofit organization, and our library of more than 300 learning resources is developed and reviewed by experts in their fields of study. Both Gary and Ivo serve as subject matter experts on several of our modules, including those on oncology business acumen. Welcome, Gary and Ivo, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so today our learning objectives are on the screen, and we're going to focus on three key areas of oncology business acumen. The first will be the why, so clinical outcomes in oncology. The second will be the who, so stakeholder needs, including patients, providers, and payers. And finally, the how, or reimbursement in oncology. Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to better understand our audience. So please let us know if your role is related to training, sales, account management, or something else. And if it's something else, you can type that into the question window on your screen. So we'll take just a moment. Tim has shared the poll to hear from our audience. Tim, you just let me know when it looks like everyone is finished.
Well, thanks, Michelle. It looks like most of the votes are in. I'm going to ask everyone to wrap up their poll choices in the next couple of seconds, and then I'll close the poll. Everybody, thanks so much for sharing. I appreciate that. Let me close the poll, and let's all look at the results. Here you go.
Okay, lots of trainers. That's great. And a few sales and few account management and some others. Thank you all. That's very helpful to understanding who our audience is. So we're delighted that you all could join us. So let's dive right in and get started with the why, our clinical outcomes. Gary, I'd like to start with you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about in the ways in which enhancing an oncology business acumen among life science professionals can contribute to improved patient access to new treatments.
Yeah, so enhancing oncology business acronym among life science professionals empowers them to navigate complex market dynamics, develop effective access strategies, and collaborate with prescribers and their office staff to ensure that new treatments reach patients' needs. For instance, offering programs such as copay assistance, patient access hub, or patient support services to address affordability concerns and enhance the overall patient experience.
Mm-hmm. are all areas I know that many of our companies work in. Thank you for that. So then moving on to Ivo, perhaps you could speak to how clinical research outcomes directly impact decisions in oncology therapy development and market introduction, given your background. Ivo?
Oh, thank you. Well, let's start out with what a clinical trial does. A clinical trial in oncology tells us about efficacy, whether it has the pharmacological effect in a large group of patients, and achieves the primary and sometimes the secondary endpoints. They're adequately powered, but it's mostly focused on efficacy. Initial safety information is also provided, but obviously if you have a trial of two times 300, 400 patients, which is quite typical in oncology, you're not going to get much safety information. And that's where then later on we need to do, and industry sponsors then follow-on studies, observational studies, secondary database analyses, also exploration of adverse event registries to get a better handle of how these drugs, these new treatment regimens work in patients and in oncology care at large. In all of this, what is very important is or are the NCCN guidelines. And that goes to market introduction. Typically, the NCCN, if there is good evidence, not only from trials, but also from other studies, they will integrate that into their guidelines. And that is important because it's also something that then payers take into account in their decision making. It may not only be the approved indications, but also those that are off-label, but where the evidence is high. So that. And then one other element that I want to add is that payers increasingly also want to know, and that's important from a market access point of view, who are the patients who really benefit from a drug? Because think of a trial, there's some patients in the new drug arm who may do just as well as those who are in the old drug arm. Payers increasingly want to know who is going to benefit the most, and those will then be the patients who will be approved for treatments.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That importance of personalized medicine, I think, as some of these more and more treatments come out that are very, very targeted. So that's great. Gary, anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think what's important too is that there are many FDA-approved indications for drugs, but in oncology particularly, there are also additional studies that show value for those products to be used. So being able to understand not only the FDA-approved indications, but all the compendium use of products are really important in order to support patients' needs.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you both. Okay, let's go into the second area, which are stakeholder needs, the varying needs of stakeholders, which we define as patients, providers, and payers. Okay, Gary, can you please speak to how the needs of these stakeholders differ and how oncology business acumen can help address these diverse needs?
Yeah, particularly in high-cost pharmaceuticals and complex pharmaceutical prescribing, as in the case of oncology, the stakeholders' needs are quite diverse. So you have your payers who are looking to optimize care, both from a clinical efficacy and price, and yet you're having the prescriber who's really just focusing, what's best for that patient. And as we're moving more into precision medicine and oncology, there can be quite a diversity of opinion relative to those two stakeholders, relative to what is most appropriate for a patient, and from a payer perspective, from an affordability and a clinical value proposition, what's on the formulary, what are the guidelines associated with certain drug therapies. The patient is in the middle of all that because at the end of the day, both the payer and prescriber have the interest of having these patients treated appropriately, but yet their views may be different from an economic versus clinical perspective. So I think it's important to understand those dynamics. And then when there is alignment, and what I define as alignment is a drug is required a prior authorization, the prescriber submits that prior authorization to the payer approves that prior authorization. So now the patient has access to the drug. The patient then, we look at concerns that the patient may have from an affordability standpoint. So that's where commercial copay cards, pharmaceutical assistance programs, not-for-profit funding agencies can all support patients from an out-of-pocket perspective.
Absolutely. Eva, would you add to that?
No, I totally agree with what Gary, and he pointed out some very important things.
Mm-hmm. In terms of payer concerns as they relate to, treatment outcomes and cost, how is it beneficial for those working in customer-facing roles to really understand not only the decision-making process, but some of the reimbursement mechanics behind that? Can one of you speak to that?
Sure, I can start with that. I mean, from a payer concern, I mean, it's really the value, it's the value for money. I mean, and payers prioritize treatments that offer, demonstrable value in terms of improved patient access, patient outcomes relative to costs. They seek evidence of cost effectiveness and long-term benefits to justify business decisions. Payers are also concerned about the budget impact. As we see more and more health plans today becoming self-insured, we have to look at the budget impact of new treatments on healthcare systems, particularly oncology, where costs can be substantial. Professionals with enhanced business acronym can conduct market assessments, identify key stakeholders, and formulate targeted access strategies tailored to different geographic regions or patient populations based on payer formulary access and utilization management criteria.
When you mentioned that many health plans are becoming self-insured, when they make coverage decisions, reimbursement decisions, do those look basically the same as payers, or are they different?
They're similar. They're similar from what I would call from a conceptual standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
The budget impact becomes it has a bigger impact on decision making of formulary and access for drugs, because they're passing on the cost of very expensive pharmaceuticals to a smaller group of employees and their families. So if you look at a small self-insured group that is 25,000 total lives, including employees and families, compared to a large group that has 250,000 lives, and you can appreciate that the cost associated with expensive therapies are shared among a larger population.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding those differences are really important, and then being able to provide support for those self-insured entities creates tremendous value, not only for the payer, which is ultimately the employer, but also for the patients.
Absolutely.
And I think in all of this, we also need to consider the providers. Providers are increasingly talking about the economics, and you may have heard that a metric in pharmacoeconomics is the quality adjusted life year. Its future in the US is limited because Inflation Reduction Act, some other legislation is really essentially outlawing use of qualities. But there's another aspect here, and I'll illustrate with an anecdote. Very well-renowned, very well-renowned GI oncologist whom I happen to know had this perspective on quality-adjusted life years. And I'm in the business of telling people or giving people very, very bad news, and especially GI oncologists, very, very bad news. But in the same 15 minutes, I have to give them hope. So I will talk to them about how much life expectancy there is with a treatment and say it's 3 years. But I'm not going to tell them that it's only 1.5 because the quality adjusted life year dings it by half. And that's a very important point to understand. Oncologists are very evidence driven. They know the literature, they follow the literature, they go to the conferences, they go to the follow-up meetings in their region after ASH, after ASCO. So they're very evidence driven, mostly for the better, that they consider clinical trials as well as the post-approval evidence that accumulates. Sometimes a little bit for the worse, and that is that they only believe in RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Well, we already know that is about efficacy. It's not about effectiveness and more safety in the real world. Also, from a business acumen point of view, to remember that younger oncologists and community oncologists are more likely to criticize industry for the cost of cancer treatments. And that's a whole other discussion. Yes, cancer treatments are very expensive, and there's some other biological treatments especially. We have made enormous advances. That's a whole other debate. And don't get trapped into those discussions. And the final thing is, when interfacing with oncologists and hematologists who treat patients 5 days a week, community oncologists, is to not only know your drug or your drug regimen, but to be able to compare it to other drug regimens. Not from the point of view of, look, we have an edge here, but to give them the evidence, even if there's some things about your drug or regimen that is not as good as another aspect, because the payer may have that other regimen or your regimen on its formulary.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that providing clear and accessible information about treatment options, side effects, and supportive care resources can empower patients to make informed decisions and to become more actively participants in their care. So I think what we're both saying is really the importance of information, the importance of a collaborative approach in order to really engage all three disciplines we're talking about: the payers, the prescriber, and the patients.
Absolutely.
Keep in mind, being an oncologist, hematologist, a cancer doc, you see most of your patients die. And especially those who come in with advanced disease. So there is a burden that we need to be aware of, a burden among providers, on providers, a psychological, personal burden, just as we would all be burdened by seeing our patients die.
Very true. Very true. Okay, well, let's move on to our third area, which is reimbursement. And I think that we would like to gain a little bit of information from the audience next, if we could. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. So before we dive into reimbursement, just take a moment to respond to one of the two questions, depending on which one's more applicable to you. And again, responding in that question window. And let's see what other ideas that the audience can share with us today. Hey, Jenny, any thoughts there from the audience?
I think people are maybe still taking some time to type.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We'll wrap up here in just a minute.
Okay, so we have one comment. Often teams are instructed to discuss with specific cross-functional colleagues, experiential learning where reps walk through the process and an example, for example, a word problem are most effective. And then we've got another comment. We build workshops allowing verbalization through different scenarios.
Oh, both great ideas. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay. So as we dive then into reimbursement, our next question is for Ivo. And Ivo, can you speak to how important it is for life science professionals to understand the reimbursement landscape? And what impact does that understanding have on patient access to oncology therapies?
Well, it's a bit of a jungle out there as more and more payment methods are put in place. But here are a few very important things. You need to know, especially as you engage with a cancer provider, whether it's a large organization, whether it's a regional organization, whether it's a local, small cancer group, as to how they get paid for the treatments that they administer. And first of all, you need to know about buy and bill. Maybe you already know about it, but with buy and bill, the manufacturer provides the outpatient office with the product through a contract, discounted and a pricing discount, and then the provider bills the insurance company. It's a little bit simplified, bills the insurance company, and may be able to get a little bit of margin on that. In the same time, actually, the manufacturer also gives rebates to the third-party payer, to the insurance company. And then there's still the patient co-payment or co-insurance that comes into play. Then we also see beyond buy and bill specialty pharmacies that manage and distribute oncology drugs, and that falls under the category of bagging. White bagging is that specialty pharmacy ships oncology drug to the physician office, and then the physician office, the cancer provider, administers the drug. Brown bagging is that the patient picks up the prescription at their pharmacy and, like a brown lunch bag, that's where the term comes from, go to their treatment center and are administered the drug. And then there's a little bit more recently the so-called clear bagging, and that is that, especially among larger providers, that they have their own in-house specialty pharmacy. So they get accredited as an in-house specialty pharmacy, which obviously means now they control a little bit more of the money and they may get a little bit more margin. There's also the role of pharmacy benefit managers in all of this, and that's something you need to take into account as well.
Definitely, definitely. Well, I think, reimbursement in oncology can be very complex, obviously, and I think that most or all of the companies that we work with share a common goal of ensuring that patients have access to the treatments that their clinicians prescribe for them. And I think if we could go, to the next slide, we wanted to share, just ensuring that, customer-facing teams can speak knowledgeably to areas like formularies, clinical pathways, utilization management is critical, I think, to market access. And we've got just a couple of learning pathways, sample learning pathways that we've seen used to ensure customer-facing teams have the knowledge that they need in this important area. So looking at level 1, for example, that most commonly used for someone who may be new to oncology, the therapeutic area of oncology, while the second level may be more commonly used for tenured positions or account managers. But most typically, these learning pathways are customized to meet the individual needs of our clients. So just kind of speaking to some of the areas that you mentioned and content that you both have worked on. And if we could, you know, go to our slide in terms of how, Gary, how doctors can ensure that their field teams can effectively navigate these complex conversations. And you speak to that, and while keeping the patient at the center.
Correct. So you know, there's a number of steps. I mean, you know, developing comprehensive training programs that cover both clinical aspects of oncology therapy and the economic considerations surrounding treatment costs. Ensure that the field teams are equipped with deep understanding of pricing models, reimbursement mechanisms, and healthcare economics to facilitate informed discussions with stakeholders. Emphasize the importance of patient-centric communication skills in training sessions. Train field teams to actively listen to patients' concerns. Empathize with the financial challenge. Recognize that different stakeholders have varying priorities and informational needs. Provide field teams with tailored messaging strategies for engaging with healthcare providers, payers, patients, and caregivers, ensuring that the conversations are relevant and impactful for the specific audience. Foster a culture of continuous learning and development within the field team by offering ongoing training opportunities. As we have shown previously, we have different levels of training. Update on evolving healthcare policies and reimbursement trends and forums for sharing best practices and lessons from real world experience. And lastly, encourage collaboration between field teams and cross-functional teams, including medical affairs, market access, and patient support services to leverage diverse expertise and resources in addressing these complex conversations around oncology therapy costs while keeping the patients always at the center.
Thank you, Gary. Good strategies. And as we come up on the hour, I'd like to, wrap us with the last question and ask Ivo to please speak to some of the emerging trends in oncology that life science professionals need to be aware of and how those trends impact market access strategies.
Well, things are only going to get more and more complex, but also more and more precise, and that is where precision oncology comes in. It started in the late 1990s, and now we have, of course, the big successes like Keytruda, and I usually work with the generic name, so pembrolizumab, nivolumab, and so on, enormous advances. And what we've really seen is since the early 2000s, and Gleevec, imatinib is a good example of that, is that with small molecules, we could do switches. We could switch something off, and that has made, with imatinib, a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, then chronic myeloid leukemia is no longer a lethal disease. It just turns it off, and these patients do not die. Most patients do not die from their cancer anymore. And then what we have seen in the last 12, 13 years with CTLA-4 and then the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors is that we're talking about pathways. We're not talking about treating tumors in a particular part of your body anymore. Keytruda just got its 13th indication approval recently. And then the other one is the merging of therapeutics and diagnostics, theragnostics, they call it as well. And we need to ask one question, and that is, will all cancers become rare diseases because of what we know about the genetics and the genomics of cancers?
Wouldn't that be wonderful, especially to see in our lifetime?
Yep.
Well, I see that we're just coming up at the top of the hour. So if We were hoping to have time for questions, but we don't. But if you do have a question, please type it in the question field. I promise you that Ivo or Gary will get back with you. One of us will get back with you. But I'd like to take a moment and thank Ivo and Gary for sharing their expertise and thoughts with us today. I'd also like to thank our audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. If you have questions about the discussion or want to learn more about how CMR can help you develop your own learning journeys in oncology business acumen, please feel free to reach out to us at the contact information on the screen. Thanks so much to both of you, and Tim, thank you to you.